Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're from. I'm Allison Morse-Katzman from Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership Against Domestic Violence and Elder Abuse, and welcome to our next installment of What's Faith Got to Do with It, the 2019 webinar series supporting victims and survivors of faith. If you have been following our series, this is our 8th webinar that we're presenting today. And if this is your first one, know that we have one more coming up on May 22nd. You'll see at the end there's a list of the date and the topic. I want to thank, I forgot, I'm the one that has to move these. I want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women for their support for this webinar series and for much of our work that Safe Havens does. We are really honored to be able to do this work, and it's because of them. So we're going to get started right away. I want to introduce our next webinar, Domestic Abuse Through a Jewish Lens, Shanda, Stereotypes, and Shalom, Bayit. Our presenter today is Julie Udovin. She is the Outreach and Program Coordinator of Journey to Safety, the Domestic Abuse Program of Jewish Family and Children's Service in Greater Boston. Julie, I've worked with Julie for many, many, many years. She probably doesn't like that I say so many, but she and I have worked together in the Greater Boston area. We both sit on the Jewish Domestic Violence Coalition for Greater Boston, and we train together and have trained together in a number of situations. Julie, before moving to Massachusetts, Julie spent 10 years working at Safe House Center, a domestic violence program in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and she's also held positions at the Union of Reform Judaism's Religious Action Center, the American Jewish Committee's Washington, D.C. office, and the American Arts Alliance. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Julie.
Thank you, Allison, and hi, everybody. First, I would just want to add a couple of my own thank yous to Safe Havens. You have been amazing in putting this webinar series together and envisioning it and making it all happen. And also, lots of thanks to OVW, and also, I'm going to try to get these letters in the right order, JF&CS, for all of your support and ongoing efforts to do this work. So thank you, thank you. Before we get going, I just want to say a quick word about self-care, and hopefully those of you who are on the webinar know all about self-care and are practicing it every day and all of that stuff, so hopefully this goes without saying. But we always start our workshops or our presentations just with a note that if anything in this conversation brings up something from your present, from your past, whether it's you or somebody that you care about, we just really encourage you not to sit alone with that, but to reach out, to find somebody to share your story with, whether it's your supervisor or a close friend or an anonymous hotline, but just to take care of yourself through this process, of learning this material and talking about this material just as you would, around everything else. So just a little plug for self-care. And then one other introductory piece, which is I'm going to ask you, if you're willing to please use that chat box. This is, in the interest of full disclosure, this is my first webinar, and I'm a little freaked out that I can't see any of you and that we're not actually all in the same room having a conversation together. And so I'm going to ask you, if you want to, I know there's plenty of webinars that I've been on where I haven't wanted to say a word, so if you're in that space, that's totally fine too. But please contribute. I'm sitting here next to Allison. She's going to help with the chat box. So as you have questions, feel free to ask questions. If you have comments, please add the comments. If you have a comment on somebody else's comment or an answer to somebody else's question, please have a conversation on the chat box. That would be awesome. I won't feel like you're ignoring me or disrespecting me or anything like that. And let's, make this as conversational as possible. So please do go ahead and give those, give those shout outs. Okay. We're changing slides. Volume or speed? No. Okay. I want to, before we really dig into the material, I just wanted to call your attention to two webinars in particular, not because I think they're the best webinars in the series, but because they're all excellent, but because they have something to do with what we're talking about today. So if you haven't watched that What's Faith Got to Do with It, that first webinar from this series, I really encourage you to go back. I encourage you to watch all of them, but especially this one because it has some very foundational pieces in it about that I'm building on. So Allison and Anne-Marie did an amazing job of really laying out why we talk about faith and what it has to do with domestic abuse and faith communities and survivors and all of that. So if you missed that, please do go back to it because it has some of what we're going to talk about today really rests on the work that they did in that webinar. The other webinar that I just wanted to call your attention to is actually from a couple of years ago. This is the second time that Safe Havens has put a webinar series like this together. And so 2 years ago, Deborah Rosenblum from Jewish Women International did an amazing job of doing the Exploring Domestic Abuse in the Jewish Community webinar. And so when I watched it, I thought, oh, this is amazing. She's done a part 1, and I can do a part 2. So I'm trying not to duplicate too much of what she did. So there's a lot of really great and important information in that webinar. So I also encourage you, it is on Safe Haven's website. So I encourage you to go check that out also and watch that as what I'm creating today and with all of you is really a companion piece to this first one.
Also, just note that on your there are web links below each of the pictures, and under on the right-hand side there are web links to both of those videos or PowerPoints as well, webinars.
Okay, slide. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from, Journey to Safety is the domestic abuse program of Jewish Family and Children's Service in Greater Boston and basically and beyond. And we provide, like most domestic abuse programs, I think these days, we provide a network of different services. So we do provide direct services to survivors. And in addition to that, we provide support and consultation for friends, family, clergy, other community professionals who may call us with questions. And then we also have an education, awareness raising, and prevention component. So we are both providing services and also trying to help the world understand, and particularly the Jewish community, understand what abuse is all about and how to recognize it and know what to do and how to respond to it if they hear about it or see it. So I'm going to start with a couple of basics. You can actually slide again. Talking about Judaism and what is Judaism is a tricky thing because Judaism is not a monolith, right? There's not like a group of Jews that I could describe to you and tell you all about what it means to be Jewish. So I think it's important, especially for those of you who are advocates or who are interacting with survivors in that kind of advocate or service provider role, to understand that religion is certainly a part of being Jewish. You know, Judaism is a religion, absolutely. It has all of the markings of, you know, kind of organized religion. But a lot of people don't connect through that door, per se. So a lot of folks who identify as Jewish aren't connected with a synagogue, don't necessarily believe in God, or aren't sure or reject the concept of God, but they still consider themselves deeply Jewish or have some kind of strong connection to that. So religion is certainly a part of the story, but then also Judaism is, sort of for lack of a better word, a civilization, right? It's a story of a people. There are dates. There are, you know, notable people over the history. And a lot of people will connect to being Jewish because one of their parents was Jewish, or both of their parents were Jewish, and their parents were Jewish, and their parents were Jewish, and they place themselves in that timeline. And then other folks who choose Judaism along the way will also place themselves in that history, that story of people, even if they themselves aren't connected by blood to it. And then, of course, Judaism, being Jewish also for a lot of people is a cultural experience. The holidays, the food, the humor. If you could see me right now, you would know I was talking wildly with my hands, which is also culturally, you know, part of the package often. So it's important to recognize that Judaism is multifaceted, and people connect in different ways at different parts of their lives and at different times with being Jewish. And so if somebody tells you that they're Jewish, the questions are really about, so what does that mean to you, and how does that affect your life, and what does that mean in terms of abuse, or, you know, whatever it is. But to not assume when they say they're Jewish, to not have an instant picture of what that means, but to kind of understand what lens they're looking through and what they're talking about when they talk about being Jewish. I also want to draw a quick distinction here. This is not something like if you looked it up in the dictionary, this is not something that you would find defined quite like this. But I want to draw a distinction between the concept of being religious and the concept of being observant. Mostly I'm going to use the word observant today. I'm not sure if there's any time where I really talk about being religious. But Judaism as a religion that has a lot of laws and commandments and instructions and ways to do things and ways to think about things. And so observant folks who would identify as being observant in the Jewish community, are trying in one way or another, and this is also a huge spectrum of people, so there's a lot of different ways that this looks, but are trying as best they can to live those commandments, to live as close to the letter of the law of those commandments and laws and obligations. And so given that a lot of the law was delivered in a completely different time, in biblical and post-biblical time, there's a lot of those laws and commandments that we can't follow now. But given that, to try to interpret what we have as best we can in a way that people try to live as close to all of those instructions as they can. Those folks are observant. There are a lot of people who also will tell you that they go to temple every Friday night or every Saturday morning, that they celebrate the holidays, that they try to live their Jewish values, and who consider themselves deeply religious, but they wouldn't consider themselves observant. They're not trying to live out to the kind of as close as they can to the letter of the law, all of those commandments, but they would still consider themselves religious because of their connection to the religion and to their faith community and to their faith. So I hope that makes sense. This is one of those moments where if we were all together, I'd be looking at you to see if you were still with me. I hope that makes sense. If you're confused or want some more clarification, just add a question to the chat box and I'll do my best to come back to that. Okay. Now, a little bit on domestic abuse, and then we'll get into putting everything together. So I think a lot of you are advocates, or a lot of you have had domestic abuse 101 kind of training. So we're not going to do a whole training on that, don't worry. But I wanted to just kind of get us all on the same page with this definition of abuse as a pattern of controlling behaviors carried out by one person in an intimate relationship to maintain power and control over the other by using tactics rooted in creating fear and or hurt in the other person. Right, so abuse is this pattern of controlling behavior. There is often physical violence, but not always. That's not the defining factor. And I'll also say that if you haven't had that domestic abuse 101 kind of overview or workshop, and you're listening to this webinar for coming from another space, that you do reach out to your local program and learn more about abuse and learn more about this pattern of controlling behavior language and how a lot of our programs think about abuse. So I think with that, I'm done giving you homework. I think that's enough homework before we even talk about anything, but just, again, this is kind of foundational. So if you don't have this foundation, I encourage you to learn more and get some more information. So there are a lot of different types of abuse, and there's a lot of ways that people who are abusive behave abusively, essentially. So it could be physical abuse or emotional or verbal, it could be financial abuse, it could be sexual abuse, could have to do with technology, with all of the different ways that people have now to keep track of each other, social media, all of that stuff kind of falls into that technology abuse. And then this identity and spiritual piece, which is where we're going to put some focus. So if somebody so people who are abusive often are very good at taking all of those things that are most personal to their partner, that are most sacred, that are most who they are, and kind of turning it against them and making fun of it or taking something away from that person, whatever it is, that identity, and undercutting that identity. And within that, we have this concept of spiritual abuse. So, before I ask you a question, I'm about to ask you what some examples that you can think of how spiritual abuse might look. I just want to draw one quick distinction between faith and faith communities. So I know if I asked you what is faith and what's the faith community, you would all have great answers and you would all be right. This isn't a trick question at all. But it's important because sometimes out in the world, people get these two concepts all mushed together and assume that if they meet somebody who says that they have a deep faith, that they believe in God, that they talk to God every day, or that they pray every day, that means that they also either are connected with the faith community or in some cases would really like to be if their abusive partner would let them, or, there's some reason that they're not connected with the faith community that could be overcome so that they could get connected. And it's just important to recognize that not everybody who talks about having deep faith wants that connection with the faith community. It's great if they have it sometimes, because sometimes that means it's a way to break isolation, it's a way to be connected with other people. There are some real benefits, and we're going to talk about some of the benefits later in the webinar. But it's important not to make that jump before you kind of talk to the person about, do they want to be connected with the community, or are they already connected with the community? And similarly with the concept of faith community, there are a lot of people who go to temple every Friday night or every Saturday morning and do things with the temple, and if you ask them, they have no faith at all. They're not doing it out of a belief in God. They like the singing, they like the people, they like the social justice, sometimes they like the snacks. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that bring people into a faith community. And so it's important when you talk to somebody to, if you hear a connection to faith or faith community, to not make all of those assumptions about who they are and what they believe and what they want. That's a way into a conversation, to start asking those questions, not to see it as the end of a conversation. Okay, so now I will ask you, what might spiritual abuse look like in an intimate relationship? So if some people want to put up some ideas in the chat box about how an abusive individual might behave abusively, might prevent or encourage or whatever somebody's connection with faith or faith community, what would that look like? What would spiritual abuse look like?
Have people typing.
Excellent. Thank you for typing.
Give it another minute as we sit here in silence. Okay, so we've got Diane says misusing scripture for self-benefit, i.e. submission, sex, divorce. Lauren suggests preventing you from practicing your religious practices. Carolyn says husband forcing wife to have sex. Amy says weaponizing the idea of forgiveness.
Absolutely. Those are great examples. It looks like a couple more are coming in. You can definitely keep them coming. I'm going to put a few up. Some of these are ones that you've already named, which is awesome. So Alison, if you flip the slide. So some examples, and this may be where some of you are going with the where some of you are going in the chat box. Making fun of somebody's beliefs or practices, right? Saying religion is for children. Why would you pray? Why do you think God cares about you? All of those kinds of things that really undercut somebody's beliefs or their ability to practice. Destroying or selling ritual objects, I want to spend a minute on as something that happens that's much more profound, I think, than sometimes people realize. So if somebody has a lot of those ritual objects are connected to a story, right? Sometimes they're a wedding gift from somebody special, but sometimes they were taken from Germany or from Russia or from wherever the family came from and have been in the family for generations. And what an abusive person might do is sell them, destroy them, run them over with a car, put them in the garbage. And what that does is not only interferes with the ritual itself, but it also breaks that chain, right? It also removes the survivor's ability to touch the candlesticks or the wine cup, the kiddush cup that has been in their family for generations, and they lose that connection to family. So on the one hand, it's very frustrating when you can't complete the ritual that you're trying to do because you don't have the right things anymore, but that's replaceable. But what an abusive person can do is really destroy that connection, destroy that chain, and so that's a powerful form of abuse, right, to take that away from somebody. Forcing a person to practice or not practice a particular faith. And it's important to recognize that within Judaism, there are a lot of expressions of faith. There's a lot of different ways that people are Jewish. So even within Judaism, the abusive individual might say, well, you're still Jewish, we still go to the synagogue, but it may be a synagogue or it might be a community that person is not comfortable in, that's not how they practice their faith, that's not how they want to express their Judaism. But the abusive individual says, no, this is how we as a family are going to be Jewish. So that's also even when it's still within the broad umbrella of the religion, it may be uncomfortable. It may be something the person doesn't agree with. It may create a lot of problems for a survivor just being kept away from their connection to the faith as they understand it. And then interrupting or preventing a person's connection to a faith community, absolutely. And I think we've talked about that. And I think I saw the sacred text or using sacred text go by in the chat box. So absolutely, quoting things out of context, quoting incomplete things, saying, well, it says right here, and reading a line and not reading the line, 3 lines down that says something different, or that says, but in this case, something that would qualify it or change it. So that misuse of sacred text is significant. And I'm just looking.
So a couple of other examples of spiritual abuse have come in. Yeshaya, I hope I said that right, use of halacha as a weapon, and Hillary mentioned manipulating by saying God would be disappointed in you, or you disobeying God by not having sex with the abuser.
Absolutely. So that you are not doing what you're supposed to do as my partner. Absolutely, and claiming that authority is coming from God. God wants you to do this, therefore you have to. And then this concept of halacha. So halacha is Jewish law. So absolutely, taking things from Jewish law, taking an isolated sentence or a couple of sentences and saying, well, it says right here, or this is what you're supposed to do, so this is how you have to do it. So if anybody wants to elaborate on any of that, keep using the chat box. I love it that you all are talking, and those are really great examples. And Allison, you got the name right. Yay! All right, so, this is a new slide. Okay. So just to put a really Jewish focus on this, and this is connected to a lot of what some of you have said. So now I want to preface all of this by saying that this doesn't apply to all Jewish survivors, right, for lots of reasons. Any of these examples. There are lots of Jewish survivors who would look at this and say, these things aren't really important to me. This isn't what happened to me. So I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that this is these are problems in every Jewish home. But for some observant women, they observe something called nidah. And so they refrain from, in some cases, sexual contact with their husband, and in other cases, all physical contact with their husband during the time from the beginning of menstruation to the end. And that's a time where they understand that a couple is supposed to be apart, either, like I said, either physically or sexually or both. So sometimes an abusive partner, generally in this case it's the husband, an abusive husband will either rape their partner or will have this kind of coerced conversation to say, well, if you want to use the car this week, or if you want money for groceries this week, you'll do this for me right now. So it's a way to take that kind of a very sacred concept in Judaism, the separation and coming back together, and really destroying it and violating, and for an abusive individual to violate their partner in this very significant way. So that's an example of spiritual abuse that's pretty specific to the Jewish community. Disrupting home-based ceremonies. For example, we just had Passover a couple of weeks ago. An abusive individual, and Passover is very home-based. You have a ritual in your home where you tell the story of the Exodus, and there's a whole thing that happens in a Jewish home at Passover for folks who are observing it. And so during that home-based ceremony, an abusive individual might cause a scene, might say that dinner tastes terrible and everything is ruined, might come home 2 hours late, might do all kinds of things that will make the holiday difficult or impossible to celebrate the way that it's supposed to be. Preventing a person from saying Kaddish is another example. There's several different kinds of types of the Kaddish prayer. In this case, I'm talking about the mourner's Kaddish, so for people who are in mourning. Kaddish is, some Jewish people will understand saying Kaddish as an obligation that they are supposed to do for 11 months after they lose a loved one. And there's a lot of rules around this also, and ways to do this, and not everybody observes these rituals in the same way. So some people will say Kaddish once or twice a day, every day for 11 months. Some people will say Kaddish just when they're in synagogue. Some people will say Kaddish at the funeral and then not again. So there's a lot of different ways to do this. But for people who feel like saying that mourner's prayer for their lost loved one is an obligation, it's important, right? This is a commandment that they understand is coming from God. Kaddish is designed and intended to be said publicly, so you can't really say it at home. You need to be in community with other people. And you need to be able to get to a community that's going to say Kaddish with you. So an abusive individual forbidding their partner from going to say Kaddish is actually interfering with that obligation, and that can be devastating. So that's another piece that's just another example of spiritual abuse, looking very specifically through this Jewish lens. Disrespecting a kosher kitchen is another example. Keeping kosher kashrut is the set of dietary laws. And they're followed differently in different kosher homes. There's, again, you're getting the hang of this. If you are new to learning about Judaism, there's no one statement that covers everything. But in a kosher kitchen, at least baseline, most kosher kitchens, people will not bring pork and pork products into a kosher kitchen and will separate milk and meat and not serve them together. So an abusive individual may come home with a pepperoni pizza. That's a big problem for many reasons in a kosher kitchen. And they deliberately use the dishes, use the surfaces, really violate the space that their partner is trying to maintain as a kosher space. So that's another example. Again, somebody who believes that this is what they're supposed to be doing, either because it comes from God or because it comes from tradition, and this is how they've always kept their kitchen. To have that space invaded, violated, disrespected in that way can be profoundly upsetting and is part of this pattern of controlling behavior that abusive individuals demonstrate. These next two, interfering or insisting the family follow Shabbat holiday laws inconsistently or erratically, and interfering with Shabbat or holiday laws, those are, again, there's one rule for this Shabbat, next Shabbat it's different. The Shabbat after that it's different. And with abuse, because there's often consequences or penalties for not following the rules, when you don't understand the rules, there's always consequences and penalties, and that the abusive individual always feels, at that point then feels free to say, hey, we don't do that, or hey, why won't you let the kids play whatever today, when it wasn't okay last week, it is okay this week. It creates this very unstable feeling in the home and very unequal, off-balance feeling. Get refusal is a get is a Jewish divorce, and I'm actually going to hold this. I put it on the list because it's an important part of spiritual abuse, but we've got a slide coming in a little while that's going to have more information, so I think we're going to move past that right now. Or do we have, I'm looking at the comments just to see if
One more comment, imposing a more stringent view of halakha as a means of control, not limited to sex or the marriage at all.
Absolutely. So imposing those more stringent laws, and also that goes with it, except for when they're not so stringent, because it doesn't suit the abusive individual in that moment to be very stringent about it. So absolutely, and changing the rules. Abusive individuals quite often change the rules, and in the case of the spiritual abuse, still claim some authority from God or from the rabbi or from something to change those rules. So it's something that is very frustrating and can really keep somebody off balance. This next slide is just a reminder that with every kind of abuse, there's emotional and verbal abuse. There's that undercutting, there's that undermining, that there is often destroying of somebody's attempts in parenting to instill certain Jewish values, Jewish views, Jewish practices. And if everything is constantly in upheaval and constantly being upended by the abusive individual, it's very hard to transmit that to children. It's very hard to maintain your own practice and your own center when somebody is constantly telling you that you're childish or that you're wrong or that you don't know the law or that you're wrong about the law. All of those things really work together to upset, destroy, devastate survivors in a lot of kind of complex and intense ways. I also just want to mention here that abuse happens across the Jewish community, regardless of denomination or affiliation. You know, when I go talk to people in different communities, I hear a lot of different things. And not infrequently, I kind of will hear somebody sort of subtly saying, well, it's really them over there, right? It's that group because they're so patriarchal and women don't have any rights. Or hearing, well, it's really not us, right? Because we're living on the path. We understand how to treat women. It's those folks who aren't following all the laws that don't really understand this whole thing. And everybody winds up pointing fingers at everybody else. And so it's really important to just hold that reality that abuse happens. It has nothing to do with what denomination or affiliation or practice or anything like that. It happens. Okay. Barriers. So how are we doing in the chat box? Anybody?
Nope.
Okay. So for those of you who are advocates, this is going to look really familiar. This is just a few barriers that reasons why it might be hard for a survivor to leave an abusive relationship. So we're not going to talk a ton about this, but I just wanted to place the next section with this concept, right? So people don't leave because they still care about their partner, because they're afraid of their partner, for financial reasons, for custody reasons, for all kinds of reasons. Within that, though, we're going to look now at some of the things that are connected to somebody's, Jewish identity, whatever that means to them. So get your chat box fingers ready. I'm going to ask you, what are some additional barriers that Jewish survivors might either fear or actually encounter when they consider leaving an abusive relationship or reaching out for help? So what are some of those things that Jewish survivors might be afraid of or run into in terms of leaving or asking for help?
I feel like we should play that music.
I know. Yeah, we need some hold music going on here.
Diane says loss of community.
Absolutely.
That's a huge one.
That's huge.
Lauren says TV programs that don't understand.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, that don't understand. And especially some of the things that we've talked about on this webinar, if you think about it, how hard it would be for a survivor to pick up the phone and say, how do I explain a violation of Nida to somebody who, I don't even know if they know any Jewish people. How do I explain some of the things that are happening to me? I'm going to sound ridiculous. I'm going to sound like some kind of weird. So that real anxiety about, if I try to really talk about what's going on, will this person listen? Will they laugh at me? Will they kind of think I need to be shuttled off to another program? So that can be very intimidating.
We have a whole bunch more responses, but I just want to throw in, because coming from Safe Havens and we're an interfaith organization, I think what Julie was just talking about could be any faith-based person coming to a service provider who might not understand different aspects of faith. So that's why we're so glad that you're all on this call and participating in our webinars. So Amy says faith leaders taking the side of an abuser, which happens unfortunately frequently, fear of appearing not be a good wife or husband. Shoshana won't be believed that the abuser is an active community member. Yeshaya, spiritual ramifications, feeling of my destiny / God's will is for me to stay and suffer through it. Carol, community, family not believing abuse is occurring or that the abuser could actually abuse.
Absolutely. Those are absolutely great thoughts about barriers. You all can come in next time. In 2 years when Safe Havens does this again, let's all get together and present this as a team, because you guys are awesome. So yeah, absolutely. The faith leader taking the side of an abuser, we do hear about moments where the rabbi goes to court and says to the judge, oh, a little confused, but now this person is on the path to goodness, and I vouch for them. And yeah, that people won't be believed. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read and it's scrolling, and that's probably why I should leave this to Allison. So absolutely, that spiritual ramification, that feeling of this, this is God's will. I don't understand it, but it's not for me to understand why this is happening to me. This is for, God wants me to survive this for some reason.
Shoshana mentions role as a single / divorcee in a family-centered community, and Joanne mentions feelings of shame.
Absolutely. So actually, that's a very nice segue.
Yes.
We're going to go right to shame. Thank you, Joanne, for that amazing moment there. You were right on time. So shame is, a lot of what we're about to talk about is not unique to the Jewish community, so I'm going to be using Jewish words and kind of framing it in Jewish cultural ways, but a lot of this is not unique. And a lot of it, if you do this work, even if you don't work with Jewish survivors very often, a lot of this will sound familiar. So this whole concept of shame is profound, right? Many, many, many survivors experience some kind of shame, that embarrassment, that humiliation, that feeling of how did I let this get so far, or how did I let this happen to me, all that language that we reframe for people when they come talk to us, that this isn't something they let happen or allowed to happen. But it certainly can feel like that. And especially if there's children in the home, how am I letting my children see this? I mean, all of that stuff. So there's this concept of Shanda, which I think is a Yiddish word. And Shanda it doesn't mean literally exactly shame, but Shanda has this kind of often gossipy overtone. If something's a Shanda, people are talking about it. It's the kind of thing somebody might say in a stage whisper kind of thing, like, did you hear about what's going on? It's a Shanda. I don't know if the mic picked that up or not, but and the poor closed caption person, I don't know if you got that, but that's Shanda, that private individual shame. But then also layered on top of that, for some Jewish survivors, again, not for everyone, but for some Jewish survivors, there's also this community shame. There's also this additional level of, what if somebody finds out this is going on in my home? So partly not wanting other folks in the community to find out and talk about them, but also in some cases worrying that it's going to kind of cast a shadow on the Jewish community. That, the Jewish community is supposed to be above things like violence and drinking and drugs. That doesn't happen in the Jewish community. Of course, we know that it does. But for some folks, that feeling that these things aren't supposed to happen. And if somebody finds out that they're happening, then that whole ideal of a Jewish home is going to get shattered, and there's going to be sort of almost a reflection, almost a community reflection on everybody because of this abuse. So I hope that is making some sense. But for some survivors, it's just this feeling of like a police car in front of a Jewish home when there's not a break-in and there's not a health emergency. Shouldn't be there. There shouldn't be a police car there. That's not what happens in Jewish homes. There shouldn't be a contentious Jewish divorce in open court. Those things should not be public. The dirty laundry should stay inside the home. So that shame really has those two levels of both the personal, individual shame and then also this collective, communal fear of casting a shadow on the community that you're part of, or fear that other people will look at you as if you have cast a shadow on your community. So again, not every Jewish survivor, but for folks where that's operative, it can be really powerful. I also want to talk a little bit about blame. This concept that we have of Shalom Bayit, of peace at home, right? So for those of you who work with Jewish survivors or who are familiar with the Jewish community, you may be familiar with this concept of Shalom Bayit. At its heart, it's a beautiful concept. Peace in the home, then if there's peace in everybody's home, there's peace in the village, there's peace in the region, there's peace in the, in the world, or peace in the nation, peace in the world. It builds out, and it all starts with peace at home, right? So I'm going to ask you, somebody help me out in the chat box. You don't all have to do this, but who would you guess we culturally hold responsible for maintaining Shalom Bayit? That we culturally, which family member do we probably hold responsible for maintaining peace in the home? Anybody want to throw it out there? Thank you, Denise, the wife. I don't know how many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof and know the song Tradition. There's a whole section about the mama and what the mama does. I will not sing it to you. Don't worry about it. But that whole concept of that we hold women responsible for Shalom Bayit, for maintaining peace in the home. And I have to say, I hate talking about this part because a lot of me feels like it is 2019. Why are we still having this conversation? Why are we still talking about these things? Haven't we moved past this idea that women are responsible for house and home? And when I take this conversation out into the Jewish community and I raise this question, after I speak, almost always somebody comes over to me and says, we haven't moved past it. Don't take it out. The last time that I did this, a woman just caught me by the arm at the end of the presentation, and she looked me in the eye, and she said, we're not done. Don't take it out. And she left. That's all she said, but she didn't have to say any more. So we're still talking about this in 2019. So what happens is if the wife or the mother is responsible for maintaining Shalom Bayit, and there is not Shalom Bayit, it's not a peaceful home, then women get either place blame on themselves, and the abusive individuals usually place blame on them also, and sometimes the community places that blame on them, making them either entirely responsible or partly responsible for not being able to keep their partner calm, for not being able to be a better cook or a better partner or a better housekeeper or a better mother or whatever it is, that if they could just change their behavior, they could get to that peaceful home. And that's not, and for those of you who do this work, that is not how it happens. And that survivors can't adjust their behavior and then change what an abusive individual is going to choose to do. So Shalom Bayit gets kind of grossly twisted through this, through what happens, and so women wind up feeling very responsible for what's going on in their home, even though they really are powerless to have anything change. So that Shalom Bayit can be a substantial barrier, that feeling of failure, that feeling that they should be able to fix something that they can't fix. So before we go to the next slide, I also want to name one thing that I think is important in this conversation, which is I'm using a lot of gendered language because I'm working in a lot of stereotypes and a lot of cultural assumptions. But I really want to acknowledge that, first of all, not all survivors are female, and also that a large portion of the Jewish community at this point recognizes that there are more than two genders, and that this binary language it's not always that helpful in terms of explaining relationships or talking about relationships. So I really want to name that because it's important for you all to know and think about the fact that there's gender is a spectrum, but what I'm talking about right now are some very old cultural ideas about very specific kinds of relationships. And so that's why I'm using the gender binary, and that's why I'm using so much gendered language here. This is really the only place when I talk about domestic abuse where I use this much in one space. But it's still very operative, and it's still how things are working, so we still need to talk about it. Okay, slide. Stereotypes. This is a huge barrier. So I'm going to hope that you'll do a little exercise with me. Just a reminder that stereotypes are about how sometimes people are seen through other people's eyes. But I'm going to ask you for some stereotypes, and I'm just going to ask everybody on the call to agree that we all understand that when you put something in the chat box, it's a stereotype. That's not what you're saying is true. That's not what you're saying about Jewish people. That's a stereotype that you've heard about Jewish people or witnessed or felt yourself as a Jewish person. So if you could give me, out there in cyberland or wherever you are, some examples of stereotypes of American Jewish men. Let's start with American Jewish men. So, chat box.
As you're typing, oh, well, no, wait. Wealthy, conservative, good business mind, well-educated, business money.
Absolutely. What are some other kinds of jobs that American Jewish men stereotypically hold, in addition to businessman?
Jewish men are expecting a stay-at-home wife. They're lawyers, doctors, lawyer, banker.
Absolutely. So, and are they, I'm going to ask one more question before we go to women. Are they our macho men? Are they our military heroes? Are they our NFL heroes?
No.
Absolutely. Okay.
Nerdy.
Definitely. Thank you. Oh, there's more coming in.
Women are the housekeepers and the husband is the breadwinner or provider.
Yeah. So now I'm going to ask you about American Jewish women. What are stereotypes of American Jewish women? This is harder, but there are a bunch. So what are some that come to mind?
great cooks.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought about that.
Which is interesting. Some people say, I have to say in my experience, some people say great cooks, and some people say they make reservations.
Yeah.
So it's both.
Princess, mothers, modest, Jap, overprotective.
Yeah. And
for those of you who don't know what a Jap is, maybe Julie would like to share.
Yeah, no, it stands for Jewish American Princess.
But it comes from a Jewish American prince. So we need to not forget that. Men are Japs too. Opinionated, women are opinionated, nurturing, gentle, loving, bratty.
Absolutely. And I love that you hit things that you could see as being opposites also, which makes stereotypes even more complicated to deal with. So there's one. So you hit all, like, pretty much everything that is important in this conversation. And I just want to share with you, I was talking to a college student a couple of years ago, and she was telling me that on her campus, I was doing this section, and she said, "Oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's the nice Jewish boy, the NJB." Did I get the letters right? Sometimes I get the letters right. The NJB. And I asked her, "What's the flip side of the NJB? Like, what's the other side of the nice Jewish boy? The girls or folks who don't identify as male?" And she thought, and she thought, and she thought, and she said, and she finally came up with Jewish American Princess. So we have the nice Jewish boy and the Jewish American Princess were the dominant stereotypes on her campus from her perspective. So what happens for Jewish survivors, particularly for Jewish women, is, kind of what happens when this demanding, opinionated, nurturing and gentle, but bratty, materialistic, demanding, I may be adding some into this, smart, and smart can work against Jewish women because there's also this concept, right, that you can be too smart to be abused. You can be too smart to get into an abusive relationship. So if you're well-educated and quote-unquote smart, this wouldn't happen to you. So what happens when that person says, this doctor, banker, lawyer, good to his mother, I don't know if that was on the list, but that comes up a lot, good provider, respectable, responsible community leader, screamed at me until 4 o'clock in the morning, pushed me down the stairs, did whatever they did to me. What often happens for Jewish women when they start to talk about what's really going on at home is they're met with responses from people who love them very much. These aren't cruel responses, but are met with things like, aren't you being a little dramatic? What did you do to provoke that? What caused that? Like, what could you possibly have said or done to make your partner do that to you? I know somebody who disclosed, and the person that she disclosed to said, "Oh, your expectations for relationships are really high. Every relationship has its bumps." Those are often, for people who live in these stereotypes, those are often the kinds of responses that they get. And I think, Elsie, did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to add, just the idea that one of the stereotypes is Jewish men make great husbands. That's a stereotype, a pretty well-known one, I think. And so here it is. This horrible thing is happening to the victim, and all everyone can see is, well, he's such a great husband. How could that possibly be?
Right.
You must be doing something wrong, or you must not understand him.
Right, exactly. You must be confused. You must have it wrong. There must just be a misunderstanding. And even sometimes when people disclose and are believed, they're met with things like, well, if you decide to leave your partner, your good provider, community leader, partner, husband, or partner, that you're going to have to take your kids out of that great school system, or you're going to have to go and have your kids will have a less successful, less good life or future because you're choosing to leave. So these stereotypes can make it incredibly difficult for Jewish survivors to talk about what's going on sometimes, and for their community to hear them and to really hear what they're saying. So that stereotype piece is really important. Are we doing any?
Nope.
Just want to check the chat box. Okay, let's go to the next one. And then these all didn't get their own slides because we would have been here for eternity. But these are just some additional things. That fear of experience with not being believed that we just talked about, an emphasis on home and family. It can be hard to break up a home. It can be hard to break up a family, or feeling like you're the one breaking it up, even though, we would argue that the abusive individual is the one who's kind of destroying the family or the home. It's still hard to be the one to say, I want to go. And within Judaism, there's a lot of emphasis on home and family, so it is very hard sometimes for some people to talk about trying to leave an abusive partner. There can be pressure from family, even well-meaning family. They might be afraid for their loved ones' economic stability, long-term survival, things like that. So sometimes it's about, you can just work it out. But sometimes they really will say, it can't be that bad, and it's better than living on the street, or whatever, which is a bit of an exaggeration often, but those kinds of comments. Another thing, if you're working with a Jewish survivor, if you're thinking about this, it's important to understand that a lot of Jewish survivors, a lot of Jewish people, see themselves as donors to programs, not as service recipients. This all comes back to this kind of shared cultural identity about who Jews are as a people. I'm not putting any judgment on that one way or the other, but it's just a reality, right? So oftentimes, Jews will, Jewish survivors will say, well, I can't call that hotline. I should be donating to it. That's not for me. I'm not the person who calls for help, right? I'm the person who supports that program, so somebody who really needs help can call. So that also can be a huge bias that can be hard for a survivor to overcome in terms of reaching out and asking for help from a DV program or from somewhere in the system. It can be really hard to be single in a congregation, or a minyan is any gathering of 10 Jewish adults. But minyan is sometimes just how a group of people who connect to practice Judaism together might identify themselves as a minyan. So it can be hard to be single in these groups, and people know that. It's not necessarily the one single reason that they wouldn't leave an abusive partner, but it certainly complicates things. If you see all your friends going out as couples and you think, where am I going to fit in this? And people are going to have questions, and people are going to want to know what happened, and how will this possibly work for me? And then just ongoing concerns that the rabbi or the cantor or the faith leader in that community or the community itself might blame them, take sides, divide, judge them, especially if the abusive partner is going to stay a member of that congregation. How do we continue to both be members of this congregation with this situation if I leave? And there's a lot of kind of stumbling blocks there. Okay. And then I also added in some additional barriers for survivors who are observant. And these are, so the other barriers that I talked about are pretty common to lots of different communities. We might talk about them a little bit differently. Some of these are fairly unique to the Jewish community in their own way. So the GET process, the divorce process, I put on this list. Again, hang on for just a second on that. We're going to get to a whole slide about it. But it can be hard if you're an observant Jew to make changes to your housing or to your daily activities. And one of the things that observant survivors sometimes face, and we've worked with a number of people who've had this really difficult decision of, if they are currently walking distance from their synagogue and they want to leave their abusive partner and they're going to be the ones leaving the house, they either need to find a place to live that's also walking distance from the synagogue, which means they'll remain walking distance from their abusive partner. And that can be difficult because in a lot of places, including here in New England, real estate around some Orthodox synagogues is expensive, because you'd much rather live 3 blocks from your congregation than 3 miles from your congregation in January and February, as you can imagine. So it can be hard to even find housing that's walking distance from a synagogue in some communities, or from the synagogue that the person wants to belong to. And if they wind up walking distance from their abusive partner, that's a difficult safety choice. But the alternative is then to change communities, change congregations, give up possibly your support network and a supportive clergy person if you have one there, and try to start over as a single person, possibly with children, in a new community where there might be questions and you might feel uncomfortable. So it's a really hard choice for an observant survivor to make about relocating. Shelter can be difficult, obviously. Maintaining dietary laws and things like that and communal living is difficult in shelters. There are many wonderful, wonderful shelters that do great work and provide amazing services, but it is hard to live as an observant Jew in a shelter space for more than a few days. It can be difficult. Day school tuition, day school is kind of Jewish private school, and it's a combination of a Jewish education and usually a secular education. Not absolutely always, but generally both together. And abusive individuals, we have a number of stories of abusive individuals who threaten to withhold day school tuition and say, to their partner, I know it's really important to you for our child to get a Jewish education and to be, to live a Jewish life even while they're at school during the day, but I'm not going to pay for it. If you leave, that money's gone. And so sometimes that becomes a barrier if a survivor feels strongly that they want their child in day school as opposed to in public school. Lashon hara, Alison, how do you say that?
I say lashon hara.
Okay.
But people say it different ways.
I'm just checking in. There are, as Alison said, there's different ways to say that. But this concept of malicious gossip also, there's a prohibition against gossip in Judaism. It doesn't mean Jewish people don't gossip, but somehow there is actually a prohibition against it. And so for some folks, some survivors some observant survivors in particular, may feel like consulting with their rabbi or calling a hotline or doing something like that is actually talking about what's happening to them is actually an act of malicious gossip, as opposed to what we recognize it as asking for help. So sometimes there's some concern about that. The same thing with that rebellious wife label. It's not that common, but there is a prohibition against being a rebellious wife, and some people would might worry that their act of reaching out for help might be interpreted as them being a rebellious wife. So that can be a barrier. We're now talking about not a huge number of Jewish people, but for the people that it's important to, it can be significant. And then we've talked a lot about language and some sacred texts. So, okay.
We're all set.
All right, cool. And remember, if you keep using the chat box if you have questions or want to contribute anything. This slide I just put in, if you're not familiar with kind of the workings of Jewish law by any chance, it's just important to know that there's not a central authority in Judaism, and that there's not sort of a process, the way that there is in secular court. You might go to court, you might not like the decision, you might have the opportunity to appeal, you go to the next level court, you go to the next level court. That's not how it works in Judaism. So courts, a Jewish court is called a Bayit, and it is convened, it's generally 3 rabbis. There are parts of Judaism that would also include cantors in that. And the 3 rabbis sit as the rabbinic court and can make rulings. And so if somebody wants a divorce, they're going to go in front of the Bayit, in front of this Jewish court. And the divorce has to be granted by their husband. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But just to know, there's not that centralized authority. And there are multiple ways, as we've talked about, there's multiple ways to interpret Torah, which Torah means both the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, but is also widely understood by Jews as meaning that central text and then everything that comes with it. So the Hebrew Bible and the commentary on the Hebrew Bible and some rabbinic instruction. The Torah can actually be pretty broad, or it can mean just those scrolls. But that there's multiple ways to understand Torah. It's not one central thing. And there's also some tension around understanding Jewish law, that halakha that somebody mentioned. How much you look at that through a contemporary lens and how much through a traditional lens. And then different Jewish courts are going to come to different decisions about certain things. So that might be a little bit too much inside baseball for what you need on a day-to-day basis, but really the core piece is that there is not a single central authority that somebody could go to. Now, individuals may have a central authority that they trust, and they'll say, what this person says is what I believe. That's fine, but there's not a collective body. Okay. All right, so Jewish divorce. So a get is a writ of Jewish divorce. It must be given by the husband to the wife. There's not really a way around that, or if there is, it would be accepted by some courts, but certainly not universally. It's written by a trained scribe under the supervision of a Bayit din, that three-rabbi rabbinic court, and witnessed by two people. And one of the things that's really important to hold on to is for Jewish survivors, there's a lot of Jewish survivors who don't care if they have one or not. So don't assume if somebody's Jewish that the get is going to be a big deal. There are Jewish survivors who don't even know that there is such a thing as a get. So the first issue is whether or not the person even cares. And then there's some Jewish survivors who would prefer to have one just in case they need it down the line, but they don't feel that strongly about it. But then there are some survivors that it's extremely important for them to have this Jewish divorce. It's extremely important for it to be granted. And that until they have it, they're still chained to their abusive husband. And they still have that, they are still married, essentially. So the get operates for almost everybody. The get is a totally separate process than a secular divorce. So somebody could have a secular divorce, finished, and 10 years later still be Jewishly married to the person. They're generally two separate tracks. So I would say the most important thing for most of you to know, unless you're working very intensely with a Jewish survivor where this is a significant issue, the most important thing to know is that there's help, that you do not have to figure this out by yourself. Certainly when we get complicated questions, we ask for help also. This isn't something that, this is a lot of legal matters. So if you are working with a survivor who's trying to get a get, and her husband is refusing, or his wife is refusing, well, I'm going to leave the standard gender because the other situation is complicated. If you're working with a woman who's trying to get a divorce from her husband, is trying to get a get from her husband, reach out. I would say your first point of contact should be to see if there is a Jewish domestic abuse program in your community. If you don't know, find out, and see what they have to say and see what their resources are. So that would be a good place to start. But in addition to that, we also have a task force here in Boston, but I think they operate nationally, and they have a great website. It's getyourget.com. And they can help too. They can provide some consultation and some assistance. And then there's also an organization called the Organization for the Resolution of Agunot, ORA. ORA can help as well. So I would say, unless this is really what you do every day, day in and day out, if you are working with a Jewish survivor who's trying to obtain a get, tap some resources and bring in some assistance for that. Okay. So one of the things about these talks is that we always spend a long time talking about all the barriers and all the problems that being Jewish could create for somebody. But I really also want to at least spend a couple minutes on what are some of the supports. So if you could use the chat box just to talk about what are some of the supports that Connection to Faith or a faith community might offer. What's the good part about all this?
Women's groups, support groups.
Absolutely. It's very powerful when people start sharing their stories and hearing about other people's lives. Sometimes it really can be life-saving. More benefits, more support?
Tight-knit families as long as they believe you.
Absolutely. Family can be a huge support in these things. Whether it's providing financial resources, emotional resources, a place to live, helping to just pull in other people, whatever it is, families can be tremendously important. Anybody else? Oh, we have to bring in a few more positives.
Anyone?
Okay.
Oh, the truth.
Truth. Beautiful.
Temporary financial relief assistance.
Absolutely.
Community and resources. Oh, from Elizabeth.
Oh.
And tangible supports after divorce. Food, child care.
Definitely. All good. All excellent responses. A safety net. Beautiful.
Restoration of dignity and faith leaders who will listen.
Love that all too. All right, so we can flip to the slide. Peace. Thank you. So I think you all covered this pretty well, but those social supports, that sense of community, to break isolation, to share your stories with other people who are willing to listen and believe you. Belief in a higher power can be a huge support. You know, that a lot of people will talk about that they got through their experience because of their faith. So that's also very important. Faith-based answers from leaders. We had a rabbi a number of years ago. We had a survivor who was in a lot of danger, and we were very concerned, and she was very uncertain about whether or not to leave. And we actually had an observant rabbi who said to her, in talking to her, so a mitzvah is, I know a lot of people understand mitzvah as a good deed, like it's a mitzvah to go visit your grandmother on Sunday because she loves to see you, and it definitely is that, but a mitzvah is also a commandment, it's an obligation, and what he said to her was, it's a mitzvah to protect your life and your child. He gave her permission using halakhic law, using Jewish language to say it's okay to go, you're in danger, and you're obligated to save your life and your child. It's okay. So that faith-based answers from leaders can be very powerful for some people. For other people, wouldn't matter at all. But for some people, it's very important. Help from the leadership, even if it's just one of the clergy people in your congregation knows what's going on, and maybe you're both at services together, that clergy person might just have an eye to make sure that that the survivor doesn't have to walk to their car alone, or isn't by themselves, or doesn't get cornered somewhere by their abusive partner in the building. So sometimes leadership just can have an eye on things. A few of you mentioned family. That's really important. And then there's the logistical part about a faith community also, right? So sometimes survivors can't really make a call from their cell phone because their calls are being monitored by their abusive partner, or the cell phone bill is being monitored. So they can't use their phone to call for help. And they don't want to look up services on their phone because they're afraid they don't really know how to clear their browser history, or that they just have no privacy. Or if they did clear their browser history, they get in trouble for that. A synagogue or a gathering space within the Jewish community can be a safe place to offer a phone in an office with a door that closes, or access to a computer, or things like that. And also, sometimes, I think somebody mentioned the financial, sometimes synagogues or rabbis or cantors have a discretionary fund and are able to provide a small amount of money that will solve a big problem. So that's also an important piece to keep track of. Okay, supporting survivors. This is just a note. I think a number of you do this work day in and day out, so you don't need my key messages. But for those of you who come to this from different places and different experiences and are looking to understand this a little bit better, these are some of the things I say either when I feel like they're the right thing to say, or when I'm not really sure what to say and I just know I should say something. So this, I believe you, and I also know that there's times where we can't say I believe you, where it's not something we can say and mean it. So you can also use I support you in that case. Telling somebody that what's happening to them is not their fault. They're not causing it. They're not to blame, even if the abusive individual is saying that over and over again, that it's not their fault. That they're not alone. That whole, and you're not alone actually really means two things, right? Because one, it means I'm sitting here with you, we're together, you're not alone. But it also means this happens to a lot of people, and especially in the Jewish community, this happens so much more than people realize and so much more than people understand. And we don't talk about it a lot, but it's real and it happens, and you're not the only one that it's happened to. And then, of course, the help is available piece, and how can I connect you with resources, or how can I support you in connecting with resources?
That's the perfect segue.
Perfect segue to resources. So these are some of my favorites. These definitely are not the only ones. If you Google Jewish domestic violence or something like that, you will find a ton of things. But these are some of my favorites. So I listed our own webpage there. Jewish Women International Clergy Resources page is a great resource. I really recommend it. It has things like prayers and sample sermons and music and webinars and holiday guides and text studies. And they also have something that they call Embracing Justice. It's a clergy guide. So if you haven't found that resource, it is a great resource. I really recommend it. Faith Trust also has a ton of amazing resources on their website. I would take a look at that. We talked a little bit about the Boston Agana Task Force already and Aura. And of course, the amazing, amazing Safe Havens website with a ton of stuff on it, lots of things, handouts, webinars, you name it. So I encourage you to check out those resources as well. And then before we go to questions, this is just kind of our closing argument here, that blame, shame, fear, control, and humiliation are not part of a healthy relationship, that love should be safe, and that when it's not, help and support are available. Spread the word. So with that, do you want questions first, or do you want to?
No, well, let's take some questions. If you have any questions, if you would write them into the chat box, and we will get to them. While you're all doing that, I will put in a plug for our 9th and final upcoming webinar on May 22nd, supporting LGBTQ victims and survivors of faith. That will be at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. We hope you'll join us for that. And I don't see anybody typing, but I did want to ask, actually, I do have a question about, I obviously work at Safe Havens. We work in an interfaith setting, so we work with lots of different faith communities. First of all, I do want to make a point. I am always amazed every time we hear from a different faith community or cultural community how many overarching similarities there are. It might not be the specific Jewish thing, but it's still like this idea is a barrier, or forgiveness is a barrier, or talking to a faith leader is a barrier because they might not understand. I think we need to keep that in mind when we want to be religiously and culturally responsive and faith responsive. But my question is about Jewish women. I have heard that they won't go to shelter.
That's largely true, but not entirely. There certainly are Jewish women who do go to shelter. But for a lot of the reasons that we talked about, there's a lot of hesitation. The Jewish women may feel uncomfortable. It depends on what's behind that. So, like, for some folks, it's going to be that feeling that they shouldn't be using resources. And going into shelter is a big resource, right? Using a room and eating food and all of that they should be donating to those programs, not using those programs. So there's some of that. There's some bias in the community. I think that's not those aren't women like me. They're different, which, we know is not really the case, but there can be this perception that somehow they shouldn't be there for lots of reasons. And then certainly for observant Jewish women, there's a whole other list of reasons why there's some real barriers to trying to live an observant Jewish life in a communal living situation that's not specifically Jewish. And there are a handful of communities that do have Jewish shelters, that do offer shelter to observant Jewish women, well, to any Jewish women, but particularly observant Jewish women. So it's not that there are none of them, but they're few and far between. Is there anything you want to add to answer your own question?
No, not at all.
Okay.
We don't have any questions. So if that is the case, Julie? Yes.
I'm just going to jump in, because I also know sometimes with these questions, the chat box can be a little bit challenging if you don't want to ask your question publicly. So my contact information is up in the chat at the beginning, and I think Allison's about to put it in at the end too. I really encourage you, if you want to talk more about something, if you have questions, if you disagree with something that I said or something didn't sound right to you, please get in touch with me, because I would love to learn from you, and I would love to answer any questions or hear more about your experience and where you're coming from. So I encourage you to continue the conversation beyond this webinar. So please do feel free to be in touch for any reason, with any feedback or with anything. And fill out the evaluation, please, also, and Allison will tell you more about that, because I would love that feedback, too.
I keep talking while I just finish typing in your phone number, please.
I will say thank you while Allison is typing. I'm tremendously grateful to all of you for being on this call and for participating. It is very strange to not be able to see you all, so hearing your voices in the chat box really made a difference. So thank you for hanging in there with us. And
I want to thank you as well. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you to NCJFCJ. They are great partners. We are so lucky to have them doing all the troubleshooting and all the technical stuff that we certainly would not want to have to deal with. And I want to just point out on this last page is Safe Havens Connect contact information. If you have questions and you missed Julie's contact information and you want to get a hold of her, you can let me know, or you can reach out to us. We also have lots of resources, Jewish resources and other resources on our website. And I guess that's it. Thank you all, and I hope we'll see you on May 22nd. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.